we have this shot from "O Brother, Where Art Thou?" It's a beautiful composition in its execution of leading the eye, which we can see miles and miles of rural Mississippi, but the lines of those roads, they lead us directly to the subject in this nice little X marks the spot fashion. All right, great. Okay. So yeah, we're going to talk about framing, but particularly we're going to talk about composition within framing. Some of you know that I have a small background in film. I've always loved film, but I very quickly realized I did not like filmmaking at all. So I'm not in that field, but I did learn a lot in that brief time that I was studying film, and it translates pretty one-to-one to design. So I put together this little presentation that demonstrates a few examples of those principles and the crossover between them. So every time you talk about cinema, you run the risk of sounding pretentious, so I'm going to try not to do that, but this is art, and we're going to appreciate it together. So here we go. In filmmaking, there are many ways to compose a shot. When properly considered, the framing of the shot can communicate a myriad of feelings and emotions simply by the way the subjects are arranged within their environment. So we're going to focus on the graphic principles and elements and dynamics of these shots and connect them to our world of design. So in this very first one, we have a scene from Ozark, and we see Marty blocked into his position by an unknown individual. And what sorts of feelings arise from this composition? Maybe fear, maybe uncertainty, maybe claustrophobia. And we're going to examine why that is. While this is a very dark frame, I want to note the use of light and dark. Marty is silhouetted in a lighter metal sheet with the background. To the left of him, there's this dark block of color. And to the right, there's this another dark block and this imposing figure that actually intrudes in on the white space. So when we look at this from a figure ground and subject sort of abstraction, it's really interesting to note a hard line and then the organic line of the figure that imposes in on the subject, which gives that kind of intense claustrophobia, which is interesting. On the kind of opposite side of the spectrum, we have this shot from "O Brother, Where Art Thou?" And we're treated to an almost inverse of that previous one. It's a wide establishing shot of the crossroads, and it brings up feelings of openness and freedom. It's a beautiful composition in its execution of leading the eye, which we can see miles and miles of rural Mississippi, but the lines of those roads, they lead us directly to the subject in this nice little X marks the spot fashion. There's a lot of negative space, a lot of openness. It's a very comfortable frame to look at. Now back to another claustrophobic shot. I think this one is brilliant. So let's examine this frame from the Fellowship of the Ring. The bottom right, the hobbits are huddled in this tight little formation, and in the top left, the hooded and horrifying Nazgul looms above them. So let's consider the placement of each one of these subjects. Notice how there's just a tiny little amount of room for the hobbits, and there's the canted or Dutch angle of the camera. This angle that we're observing from everything's kind of at a tilt. It conjures up feelings of unease, unbalance, danger. And the interesting thing is this frame can be almost perfectly diagonally cut in half, and still the amount of space that we give to each subject is drastically different. So when we look at it in an abstracted form, the exact same story is told as blobs, and it works really well. You know exactly what's going on here, even though they're blobs, which I think is awesome. This shot from The Mandalorian is beautifully composed. Our eye is drawn directly to the center of the frame. And much like the first shot we looked at, the main subject is silhouetted by light. And the only intrusion into the child's space is the arm of the Mandalorian, which is significantly less imposing. Graphically, this is a very flat shot, which is very interesting. If you just give it figure ground, nothing of any importance is lost to the story of this frame. Everything takes place all on the same plane, which is really interesting, and a thing to consider when incorporating it into design is that a lot of times things work when they're all in the same plane, and you don't need to use a ton of dimension to communicate something really interesting. This is a simple shot from the Banshees of Inisherin, but a lot is inferred in the way that it's composed. Podrick and Colm occupy the far edges of the frame with enough negative space between them to fit one or maybe even two characters. It's a very open shot, but there is a level of contention that can be felt by the choice to seat them on the far edges of the frame. And the choice to show them from a camera angle that depicts them as being as far away as possible within their situation of being seated at the table. If this was a friendly relationship, we would see less space between them, maybe. That's interesting to consider. This shot from Last Night in Soho, we see a creative use of repetition within Eloise in the staggered mirror. You could say that the multiple mirrors suggest a barrier between the characters, acting almost like jail bars, which, if you've seen the film, is appropriate that Eloise has little to no ability to influence Sadie's reality from her own. And this is a really interesting shot to look at abstracted. It can be translated in several different ways, which is pretty interesting. And then here are a few more examples that I just like to point out, a few action moments of dynamism, certain things that you can see, like contrast, balance, emphasis. I love the frame within a frame within a frame in the No Country for Old Men shot. You take the broad entirety of that frame, there's frame one, the frame of the box of the television, there's two, the screen, there's three, and then fourth is the reflection of the window, and in the bottom is our subject of that reflection. Our eye is drawn to that tiny little section of this massive frame, which is really beautiful. I also like the Baby Driver scene, how it's composed, where everything also takes us to the center, but there is a lot of leading lines in the way the diner, the walls, the countertop, the ceiling, they all point us to John Hamm pointing a gun at us, which is pretty neat. So we're going to take a look at these principles from the world of design. So this is an example from Giant Ant, and I think this was a Slack ad. And it's a great example of symmetry and leading lines. It's very similar to that shot we looked at a little earlier from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? In here, this one from Buck, the utilization of scale to communicate contrast, the difference in size of the Coke bottle and the Ladybug character, similarly to how, from Star Wars, they utilize scale. I think Ordinary Folk they're masters at saying a lot with very little, but I love their use of dimension with this. Even though it's just single point perspective, you get a lot of depth in it. Always pay attention to the leading lines. It's very similar to something like out of 2001: A Space Odyssey. This was from Hue and Cry. And the interesting thing about this is that the eye bounces around a lot. There's not really one particular space for us to settle. Each character is compartmentalized and separated from the other, and we're kind of left to drift around which one to focus on. something that you see in movies like Rear Window. There's many different subjects, and the eye is kind of left to wander to whichever one interests it the most. And then this is an example from, I think this is, Neighbor, and the idea of utilizing pattern and then breaking the pattern. So there's no doubt where you're supposed to look in this frame by simply choosing to make that light bulb a different color. It draws the eye directly to it and doesn't really let it go anywhere else. And that's similar to something like this from Fargo. It's a very simple pattern. It's very elegantly composed, but the fact that the car and the subject are different, they break the pattern. The eye is drawn directly to it and doesn't really travel anywhere else. And then we have an example from our own studio. We narrow the focus to the middle of the frame, but the top and bottom still serve as space to provide context to what we're doing here. And similarly, this is a scene from Baby Driver. We are focused right in the center, but the top and bottom of the frame show us a broader context of him being in a car and him being behind the wheel. So, in closing, how does this help us? Well, I'm going to say something a little controversial here. You can steal these. Compositions aren't copyrighted. And so if you see something in film or television or anything that moves you, I've done this before. I duplicate it, I abstract it, and then I apply my own graphical take to it. And if you can find out why it works as blobs, you can apply your own take, your own design, your own style to it, and you'll have a dynamic frame 9 times out of 10. So that's what I got. Thanks for letting me nerd out for a little while over cinema. I hope it was insightful. And if you have any questions or comments or just want to praise movies with me, I'm cool to do that too.